If you've been riding motorcycles for a while, you'll know that the rear suspension and brakes play an important part in the handling of the bike. Hello, my name is Bob, and once again I'd like to welcome you to another episode on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. In this episode we're going to be looking at servicing the swing arm, the back brakes, and we'll also be doing a wheel alignment. Once again it'll feature my venerable Katana 1100 Suzuki, but many of the techniques that I'll show here will be applicable to a broad range of motorcycles, and I hope you find the video useful. I start by removing the gear shift linkage. On the Katana, the rear set lever is held in place by an external snap ring, and an adjustable shaft and rose joints connected to the bracket on the gearbox, which is removed by undoing its clamp bolt with a 10mm spanner, after which the linkage can be removed in its entirety. Next, the sprocket cover is removed. The original bolts in this cover have been replaced with 4mm cap head ones. The bolts are of different lengths, and almost out of shot is the wooden holder I use to keep them in the position they have on the bike. The next thing I do is remove the chain guard. It's held by 2 screws along the front of the guard. The back wheel comes off next, and I start by removing the safety clip, axle nut and washer. Then I back off the chain adjusters so that the wheel can slide forward. Then, using wood blocks to hold the wheel up, I pull out the axle. I then remove the chain from where it sits on the rear sprocket and slide it forward past the drive hub, and then pull the wheel back and off the wood blocks and out from under the bike. We've got the back wheel out of the bike now, and we're just going to check the bearings, and there are 3 sets of bearings that are actually in the wheel. So if we start with the sprocket hub, there's a bearing here, which this spacer, which comes out, has to go in. So you need to check that. And then the wheel itself, there's one bearing here, and we come around the disc side, and there's another bearing there. And you need to check all of those. If there's a problem, it tends to be in these bearings, not so much in the one that's in the hub. Then it is on to undoing the bottom bolts holding the shock absorbers, before folding them back up and out of the way. I don't bother with the top bolts. Note that I use a wire hook to hold the swing arm up at this stage. The rear brake line, which is a flexible hose, is then released from the clips that hold it on along the top of the swing arm, after which the torque rod or brake arm is unbolted from the rear brake caliper. Finally, the bracket holding the brake hose at the end of the swing arm is undone, and the brake caliper is hung up out of the way. Then the bolt holding the torque rod to the front of the swing arm is removed, along with the brake arm. This allows the brake hose to be detached from the clip that holds it at the front of the swing arm. The nut holding the swing arm pivot bolt is then undone and removed along with its washer, followed by the pivot bolt itself. After which the swing arm is pulled back and out from the frame. With the swing arm removed, I take this opportunity to grease the spindle on the rear brake lever. After removing the clamp bolt on the lever and undoing the adjacent foot peg, the lever can be removed. A clevis pin attaches the brake cylinder piston shaft to the spindle, and I undo this along with the brake switch spring and withdraw the brake spindle from the frame. The spindle shaft and cylinder are then cleaned and given a coating of fresh grease before refitting. Followed by the brake cylinder piston shaft, switch spring and lever. On this bike I've used a centre punch to provide an alignment mark so that I can place the brake lever back in its original position. And finally the foot peg is reinstalled. Off camera I've checked the chain and sprockets, but these models are notorious for stripping the thread on the drive sprocket nut, so I remove it to check. The thread is worn and I end up making a better one. I made a video on that job, but if you want to see what I did, there should be a link above. We've got the swing arm out of the katana now, and we're just going to disassemble the bearing area. There are little end caps which have this is all covered in grease, but it's got a little washer there. Technically correct, it's probably a shim. And then there's a spacer that will slide out with luck. And then inside there is a needle roller bearing. It's all in a cage. It won't come out unless you knock it out. I don't knock them out. I just clean it up, check the condition, and then make a decision as to whether I replace them or just re-grease them and reinstall. The one on the chain side is often the one that may be defective, in that it has the stress on it, and also it tends to get a lot of water, etc., thrown up as the bike goes along in the rain. The swing arm is all cleaned up now. The bearings, the needle rollers, whether you can see in there. Needle rollers are good, both sides, which is always good. There's a little bit of marking up on this one. I don't get too worried about that. This is another one of these ones, a bit like the steering head bearings. The movement is very minor because the swing arm is moving very little as you go along, so you tend to get a mark where the weight's carried, and I'll just move it around to the other opposite end. There are, however, some other issues that I am going to deal with. The other issue I need to deal with is there is a fair amount of play in the brake stay or the brake arm. If I close that in, as you can see, a bit of movement. If you ride along, you'll hear it as a clatter every time you put on the rear brakes. And essentially what's happening is it's driving down into there and it's worn the whole egg-shaped. So the whole thing moves around. We're going to repair it. It's as good a time as any. It's out of the bike, so it's, ready to go. However, probably a couple of points to note. I won't show you the repair because it's outside the general thrust of this video. Now, of course, when you have one, you always have another. So this is the other end of the brake arm, and I think you can see there, without me bringing the arm over, that's also been worn in an oblong fashion. You may as well repair it at the same time, make it all fresh and ready to go. Off camera, the worn brake arm mounts for the swing arm and the brake caliper have been machined and bushes fitted, and these have been locked in place with Scotch keys. With a little bit of luck, there'll be a link up there that will take you to a video, shows you how it was done. But for now, it's on to refitting them to the bike. Before refitting the swing arm, I re-grease the needle roller bearings, fit the bearing bushes, then the shims, and finally the bearing caps. Note that the bearing bushes are fitted with their markings to the outside. Then making sure to fit it inside the chain loop and under the rear brake hose, I slide it back into position on the frame. It is meant to be a tight fit, so a bit of force is required. Once I have it in place, I slide in the swing arm pivot bolt. Finally, I use a torque wrench to tighten the pivot bolt. Specification for the nut is 40 to 61.5 foot-pound or 55 to 85 newton meters. Then it is back on with the torque rod, fitting it first to the swing arm and then onto the brake caliper. Then I refitted the brake hose to the caliper. Off camera, once the wheel is back on, I will bleed the brake system. After that, I refit the shock absorbers. Refitting the wheel follows a bit of a process. I first loop the chain over the sprocket, with the reel resting on a wood block so it is roughly in line with the axle path. I refit the sprocket hub spacer and the chain adjuster for that side. I then insert the axle and push it about halfway across. There is a spacer which goes between the brake side bearing and the caliper bracket, which I fit next, before pushing the axle through just far enough to engage this spacer and the caliper bracket. After that, I slide in the spacer that goes between the caliper bracket and the swing arm, pushing the axle through once again just enough to engage this spacer. Finally, I slide the chain adjuster for the brake side up and then push the axle through all the way. Then I fit the axle nut and washer, but don't tighten them up just yet. I then swing both chain adjusters up to engage their contact points at the rear of the swing arm and adjust them out. At this stage, I'll do a wheel alignment. There are many methods for doing this, but the technique I am using is a straight edge alongside the front and back wheels. The straight edge is in contact with the side wall of the back wheel, with the front wheel facing straight ahead. I then go forward and measure the distance front and back from the straight edge to the side wall of the front wheel. When the two wheels are in alignment, these distances will be the same. Any adjustment that is required is done by turning in or out the adjustment screws on the axle alignment brackets, and I make sure that the straight edge is always hard against the sidewall of the rear wheel. When the alignment is correct, I then adjust them evenly to tension the chain, and don't forget to tighten the lock nuts on the chain adjusters and tighten the axle nut and fit its retaining pin before you're finished. The chain guard has a clip that engages the bracket on the right side of the chain at the front of the swinging arm. Slide the clip into position first and then fit the bolts to the other side and do them up. The drive sprocket cover goes on next. And of course, here's another peek at my bolt position holder. Despite having the brake caliper off much earlier, it's only now that I inspect the brake pads, starting with the removal of their cover. The rear brake is a double action caliper and the pads float, hanging from pins running across the top. Removal of these pins allows the pads to be removed. The pins are held in place by R-clips which are removed and the pins then slid out. Spring clips hold the pads in alignment and be careful not to lose them when the pins are withdrawn. With the pins out, the pads and the pad shims can then be removed. Having removed the rear brake pads, I've taken them over to the bench for an inspection. Probably only look at the one. So this model was obviously sat a little high. They make these square ones go on a lot of bikes and fits the GSX, but fits others, and as time goes on it just wears a little low. There's a bit of a knock there, but what's more of a concern is that I've got anywhere between, well, I've got 3mm thickness, and in some places 2mm thickness. Generally about 2mm is about time to throw them out. These are so close to the end of life, I'm just going to replace them. The other thing I'll do is I'll clean up the pins, and in the process we'll give some lubrication, just minimal lubrication to the various components, and put it back in the bike. These are the new pads I will be fitting. First I cleaned up the pad shims and the pins. The pins and shims benefit from some lubrication, and here I'm using a light smear of copper grease for this purpose. The pad shims have to face in one direction and have an arrowhead stamped out for that purpose. The arrowhead points to the forward direction, which means they are greased on the side that goes against the pad with the arrows facing forward. Position the pads as they will go back into the brake caliper. That is, they will be a mirror image of each other with their shim pad arrows facing in the forward direction. With the pad shim arrow facing forward in each case, the pads are refitted to the caliper. I then position the spring clips on the pads, removing the front one to fit the first pin. Refitting the clip, I push the pin through to the second pad and onto its locating hole, making sure that the second clip is under the pin. The clips don't need to be in position for the first pin going in. I just thought it would make the process more understandable. but the clips do need to be in position before the second pin is fitted. The second pin is pushed through like the first, and I find a flat bladed screwdriver is a useful tool to force down the end of the spring clip so that the pin passes above it. Once the pins are in, the R-clips are reinserted into the pins and the cap refitted to the caliper, and the job is done. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, I'd welcome a thumbs up, and by all means, share it with your friends. This channel is about making things, fixing things, renovating things, maintaining things. And if you like that sort of stuff, and you haven't already subscribed, well, think about subscribing. It's easy. Just hit the subscribe bar down below. While you're there, ding the bell so that you get a notification from YouTube the next time an episode airs on the White Dog Garage YouTube channel. Thanks once again for watching. I look forward to talking to you in a future episode. Bye.